Are you staying the whole time, or you're just gonna pop off once we get started?
I'll still be here. I just won't, you can't see me. But you know what, like, let's just go ahead and start, because this is a recorded session, so no matter what, like, everybody will be able to see this.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just going to introduce you. So this is Jennifer Hall. She's with the Ann Arbor Housing Commission. We're going to do the same thing that we've been doing. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. And then Jennifer at the end, whenever you're ready, you can go into those Q&As and you could rattle off those questions just whenever you want. And we are good to go. Jennifer, if you're ready.
Hello. Am I able to talk with people, or they can only put questions in and then I can talk?
They'll only put questions in, and so then you'll be able to see the questions and then talk.
I see. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. You're gonna get hopefully not too bored with me being here the whole time. My name is Jennifer Hall. I'm the director of the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, have been since 2011. And I am going to share my screen and get started then. Sorry, I am trying to move this so that I'm looking at it on my main screen, but I cannot. So I will be looking sideways. Sorry about that. So the Ann Arbor Housing Commission is one of the larger Ann Arbor Housing Commission is one of the larger housing authorities in Michigan, as well as the United States. And this is our team. We have a lot of team building activities that we like to do, because we like to say we're the best housing commission in the world. And that's how we approach the day every day. So I'm going to start out talking about what is affordable housing, what's the definition, then I'll talk about what we do, and then I will go into the development process as well as what the city is doing on a policy level. So generally speaking, this is the accepted definition of what is affordable housing. Housing that is of any income, doesn't matter what your income is, but if your housing costs are less than 30% of your household's gross annual income, and that can be for renters and owners. So if you're a renter, it includes your utilities. If you're an owner, it includes your mortgages, your taxes, and utilities. Then you have an affordable housing situation. So if you're similar to me, which I can't see any of your who you are and what your ages are, when I first graduated from college with my husband and we didn't have any money, we were probably paying 50–60% of our income on our housing cost as a renter. And now that we've owned our home for about 20 years, we make a lot more than we used to. We're only paying about 10% of our income on housing. So we have a lot of excess income to spend on other items that we didn't have when we first started out in life. And if you actually pay more than 30% of your income on your housing cost, it's considered cost burdened. There's a growing new recognition and definition that transportation is an important part of your housing costs. So especially in a community like Ann Arbor, where as housing costs increase and become less affordable, people tend to move outside of the city of Ann Arbor. And so then they have to account for their travel, their transportation costs as well. So if you add your housing and your transportation together, if you're paying less than 45% of your income on both of those items, then you're not considered cost burden. You're kind of in an affordable housing range. So what does the Housing Commission do? We are actually an entity of the city of Ann Arbor, which is why we're part of this whole series that Sarah is organizing. We are city employees, but we're a separate legal entity. We're also a governmental entity. And the main types of things that we do is we own our own housing. We are the managers of those properties that we own, 17 throughout the city, 17 different properties, about a little over 500 48 apartments. We also administer a voucher program. So many people have heard of Section 8 vouchers. HUD doesn't really like to call it that. Section 8 is the federal regulation that the rules come under. So their new description is a housing choice voucher. So we have over 2,000 housing choice vouchers that can be used all over Washtenaw County as well as Monroe County. We also have a family self-sufficiency program and a homeownership program. So our goal is not just to stabilize people's housing that they live in, but to have programs and opportunities for people to become financially independent and no longer be part of our program or use our voucher there as a subsidy for a mortgage and buy a home. We have 10 people, we have more than 10 who've done this. We have currently 10 participants in our voucher program who use their voucher to help pay for their mortgage and insurance and taxes. Our entire budget is about $31 million and we have about 41 staff. So I'm going to talk about the affordable housing that we own and manage. Up until recently, all of our housing that we owned and managed had a rent subsidy attached to the unit so that everybody paid 30% of their income on their housing costs. And then HUD paid a subsidy to pay the rest of their rental costs. We recently acquired Lurie Terrace, which is a senior housing project on Huron Drive, or I'm sorry, on Huron Street. And it is, when we acquired it, there were no rental subsidies, but the rents were way below market rate rents. And we are gradually adding maybe about 20 to 25% of the units. We're gradually adding project-based vouchers to those units so that people at the lowest income level will still be in that affordable range. And so we have, this is sort of a mix of the types of units we have, mostly one bedroom, probably need a lot more two bedroom than we have. And almost all those studios are actually at Lurie Terrace. All of our apartments have deed restrictions on them so that they're permanently affordable. And we have different, depending on the program, we have different income targets and income eligibility, depending on where you live and what type of financing is used. If you look at the city, this is a distribution. I don't know if you can see it very well. It has the wards of the city and it has a distribution of the housing that we own. There's other affordable housing projects in the city that are, all over the city as well. Generally speaking, most of our tenants make below $25,000 a year. I think our average is about, I think this year it's roughly around $13,000 a year is tends to be where most of our tenants end up landing. We do have people that are much higher than that who have income from jobs. We have a very large number of our population that are either retired on a fixed income or are on Social Security disability income, and that's more in the $10,000 to $13,000 range. Sarah, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions yet, which I cannot see the questions in the way my screen's set up. Hold on a second. Is that something that you can see, Sarah?
What are you looking for, Jen?
Are there any questions that people have asked so far that I can answer?
Oh, not yet.
Okay, I will keep going. So the biggest program we have is our voucher program. Oh, now I can see there's a question way up there. Hold on, let me look. The cooperative housing in Ann Arbor, such as Arrowwood, was started in collaboration with HUD. How come we don't see more projects of a similar type, or could we see more projects like that? This is a question from Evan. I get this question all the time. I recently found out, I always knew that cooperatives were funded by HUD back in the 1960s and 70s, at least in Ann Arbor. And that was the same time that almost all of our public housing was built. And I recently found out from HUD, found out that the local co-ops were funded through a HUD program for co-ops that was advocated for by people in Ann Arbor, people that were active politically in Ann Arbor. And they were able to access HUD funding back in the day when there was a lot of HUD funding. Back in those days, in the 60s and 70s, the reason you were able to build both public housing and the co-ops as we know them is because there was significant subsidy by HUD. On the co-op side, it was through a very low interest loan. But back in those days, if you think about the cost of land as well as the cost of construction, it was much more financially feasible then than it is now in Ann Arbor to have a cost-effective project that doesn't require, in addition to just the construction subsidy, it doesn't require additional subsidy on the rent, or in the co-ops, they call it a membership fee. So for people who don't know, I believe there used to be, I believe, 6 co-ops that were limited equity co-ops, and now 2 of them converted to a market rate type cooperative. And so the people who move in, the cooperative, the members who live there are the legal organizational entity that runs the co-op. People pay membership fees instead of rent or instead of a mortgage, and that's what pays for upkeep and maintenance. And then every co-op is different because they manage themselves or their own legal entity, and so they determine what it costs to move in and whether you get any equity when you move out. So it's a limited equity co-op. It's not like a market rate housing or even a condo where whatever the market value is. On the limited equity co-ops, it's very limited. So you might pay $8,000 to move in, and then when you move out 10 years later, maybe you get $9,000 of your equity back. So you get a little bit of increased value. So the question is, why don't we see that now? That program no longer exists. The public housing program, there's not really any new public housing being built. That's a decimated funding source at the federal level, along with the co-ops. So if you were to start from scratch today, and I'll talk about the financing of housing later on, and you'll see that the numbers don't work. But I'll try to remember to include that when I talk about development costs, about why co-ops are not built today. And there's a second question: are there any properties that are outside the city limit, which I'm assuming means that we own? Nope, all of our properties are inside the city limits. Okay. Now I know how to find the questions. All right, thank you. So the voucher program, though, originally started in the Ann Arbor city limits, but it has definitely expanded to include Washtenaw County. And if we had not been able to do that, as well as we specifically added Monroe County because we have homeless veterans vouchers, and the VA serves Monroe County. So they asked us to expand into Monroe. We have, maybe a dozen people who live in Monroe County, but this is a general distribution of where our tenant-based vouchers are located, which is a tenant is if they're income qualified, they get pulled off their wait list, our wait list. Then we issue them a voucher, and they can go out into the private sector and try to find a apartment that fits their needs and the place they want, that fits the size of the voucher. We call it, you go shopping with your voucher. So, that has a certain value to it. And the landlord has to be able to accept your voucher and rent to you. Just so you know, both Ann Arbor and the city of Ypsilanti have ordinances that prohibit discrimination against a renter with a voucher for the specifically, you cannot say, I will not rent to you because you have a voucher, but that does not mean that the private sector doesn't find other ways to keep people with vouchers out of the housing. The rent can simply be too high and it doesn't meet our HUD program guidelines. They can have requirements like a certain credit score or a certain income. So there's ways that people get screened out that aren't necessarily because they have a voucher, but has to do with them being low income. And so if you look at our distribution map, about a third of our vouchers are used within the city limits. Probably 55–60% are used in Ypsi City, Ypsi Township, and then the rest are sort of scattered about. And so that's definitely a reflection of the marketplace and where people are able to find housing that fits within their voucher amount. We hear from our tenants, especially people who are new to the program, they get very upset because they cannot find a place to live within the city of Ann Arbor. There's just no vacancies and availabilities within their voucher size. And that is why we are really trying hard to add to the marketplace actual apartments in the city of Ann Arbor that we're trying to build to make more housing available to people who want that choice and ability to move and live in the city of Ann Arbor. You can see we have different specialty vouchers as well. Like I said, we have veterans, homeless vouchers for homeless veterans, and the VA actually provides services directly to those veterans, and they actually refer them to us. So they determine if someone's eligible. And then we have non-elderly disabled, family unification, emergency vouchers, and then we also have a thing called project-based vouchers. So the voucher program is typically a tenant-based program where the voucher is attached to the person, and that person goes out and tries to use that voucher in the private sector. You can also have a voucher attached to an actual apartment instead of to the person living in the apartment, and that's called a project-based voucher. So no matter who moves in, they always have to be income eligible to move into that apartment. And that's the type of rent subsidy we currently have in all of the apartments that we own and manage that have a voucher subsidy. Again, Lurie Terrace is the only one that we don't have 100% project-based vouchers, but somebody who has a tenant-based voucher could come through our regular wait list and live at Lurie Terrace with their tenant-based voucher. 50% of median income is the income eligibility for the voucher program. I'm going to talk a little bit, just sort of graphically depicting how we are funded and what that's looked like over time. So you can see back in 2008 compared to 2021, we've had a dip in our funding, and then it's been gradually increasing. This is representative of funding for our operations for both our vouchers as well as our housing that we own. It's not reflective of any development, capital improvements to properties. It's just the operational side. By far the largest funding source you can see in blue is rent subsidies. So most of the money that comes into our organization is just simply administered by us and passes through to a landlord as a rent subsidy for people who have a voucher. The red is the administration of that. The city of Ann Arbor is this little bitty sliver at the top that's in brown. So the city of Ann Arbor general fund or any other city funds is a very small portion of the funding that we use for our housing programs. This is just breaking out strictly the voucher program. And you can see again, that is a significant increase over time. In the blue is the subsidy and the red is the administrative fees that we receive to administer the program, which you can see hasn't increased significantly over time, which has had a huge impact on housing commissions all across the United States. What HUD does is they do an analysis and a calculation, and they say, okay, it costs you Ann Arbor or Detroit or Lansing or whoever, I'm just making this number up, $100 a month to administer every voucher that's in your entire portfolio. And then Congress passes a budget, and then HUD looks at the budget and says, oh, we're sorry, we cannot pay you $100 because we only have enough money to pay you $80 a month. And so every year we have a proration based on what the federal government adopts. And we've been typically in the low 80% of what is been determined to be what we need. We only get 80%. Right now, we're at 85%, I think, is our proration for the year that we're in right now. And then I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about our housing, because we used to have all public housing units up until 2020. December of 2020 was our last public housing unit that we converted into what's called the project-based voucher program. There was a recognition by HUD that the public housing program was underfunded all across the United States. And so they were losing 10 to 15,000 units every single year due to deterioration of the property, having to demo units. They were uninhabitable. And so HUD was trying to come up with a way to preserve and salvage the remaining public housing that's left. So people have probably heard of, really big public housing sites in, around us in Detroit, in Chicago, other cities that have thousands of units in really poor condition. When I started in 2011 and I walked through all of our properties, I was appalled by the condition of our properties. And when I looked at our finances and had a better understanding of how things were paid for, I truly understood why all of these public housing units across the United States were in such terrible condition, because 100% of the funding is really dependent on Congress and the president and whatever budget's adopted every year. Tenants only pay a small portion of the rent and the rest is operating subsidy. And so they're chronically underfunded. So HUD came up with a demonstration program they called RAD, Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. And it was competitive. They did it as a pilot and they opened up the application in 2013 and we applied and we're one of 10 housing commissions that were approved to convert our entire portfolio from public housing to project-based vouchers. Why? Why did HUD create that program? Because the idea of vouchers and that line item in HUD's budget continued to grow while the public housing budget continued to shrink, because there's a perception of, like, a political perception about public housing that's negative, so that's been chronically underfunded, whereas the public perception of vouchers and the idea that it's a public-private partnership has meant that it has been much better funded in HUD's budget. And so as we've made this conversion from public housing to project-based vouchers, there's not really an impact from the tenant side. We still own the property, we still manage the property, they still pay 30% of their income on rent. But HUD said, if we let you do this conversion, the amount of rent subsidy we'll give you will increase, so you'll have better operating stability. But if we do this, you, Housing Commission, you have to raise all the capital funds you need to bring your properties up to a certain condition. And so literally, I had to raise over the last 10 years about $70 million or 68, somewhere in there, just to reinvest in our properties. But you can see the impact is, this is the first year we started our RAD conversion. And here we are, we're finally done with our RAD conversion. We did add about 50 additional apartments during this process, but you can see the reflection of this purple color is the new rent subsidies we received compared to what's in green and red down here when we were public housing. It was never enough money to keep up with maintenance and capital improvements. All right, I don't see any questions, so I'm gonna keep going. We work with a lot of different partners in the community. Listed here are many of our partners. I like to say we are the bureaucrats, and our community partners are the service providers. And so, it's our job to make sure that HUD regulations are complied with, landlord tenant laws are complied with, building codes are complied with. So we're really like the compliance component of our housing. But to make it a successful housing experience, it's really important to provide support, mental health and supportive services, anything from help with crisis situation, eviction prevention is my #1 priority, quality of life, resident activities, community building, like that's what makes a successful housing project, and that helps people stay stably housed. So we have lots of different partnerships to ensure that that happens. So how are low-income residents impacted by the city of Ann Arbor's housing market? Probably all of you have your own experience with that. You all live in Ann Arbor. You know people who live in Ann Arbor. You may have kids who have wanted or tried to live in Ann Arbor, friends. So we all know what the housing market's like. It is much worse though for somebody who's low income than someone like me, for example. In Ann Arbor, the median income is last year in 2021 was $106,600. This chart is a chart that we use for any kind of federally funded program. So any of our HUD programs, this is how we determine if somebody is eligible for our vouchers, for example. And then the city also uses this chart, which is updated every year for any kind of zoning related brownfield incentives where a private developer would include affordable housing in their projects. So the only number in this chart that's a actual number that's derived from some kind of formula that somebody figured out is the 106,600. Every other number in this chart is a formula. So you'll see like, let me see if I can pull something out here. Nothing's jumping out at me, but nothing in here is a true number reflecting what a one-person household is at 30% of the median income or 50%. It's all a formula based on 106,600. And so we may have many, many more people in the one-person category that have higher or lower incomes than this and aren't really at, these levels, but this is what we use to determine eligibility. I highlighted the 60% of area median income line because that is the target for the city council and administration and the Housing Commission when we're talking about programs that are not federally funded but are local funded. That's our target income is 60% AMI or less. And just for comparison, the United States median income is $79,900 compared to the 106,600. And that includes all of Washtenaw County because it's the Ann Arbor primary metropolitan statistical area. If you take these numbers and say, okay, if this is my income, what is 30% of my income so that I know if my housing is affordable to me? So this is the same chart, but taking 30% of that income, that monthly income, and you may be surprised by how high the housing payments are, for example, at a 60% AMI level, but that's because we are so wealthy in Ann Arbor that that is literally where we fall. So every community has their own chart. And so if you go to another community, if you go to Kalamazoo or you go to Grand Rapids, you will see very different charts, much lower. All right, we have a question, so let's see. Is this showing what a person's voucher could be? That's a good question. The way we do the voucher is there's a separate number that HUD calculates and publishes for every community, and it's called fair market rent. And fair market rent is taking essentially all the rents in the marketplace and then sort of averaging them out. They don't include any subsidized housing rent, and they don't include anything that's been built in the last 2 years. And then they publish a fair market rent for your community for an efficiency 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom. I don't know exactly what the number is for us right now. I want to say a 1-bedroom is somewhere around $1,200. And so that kind of aligns with this chart a bit, but it's not an exact match. So what we do in the voucher program is we set what's called a payment standard, and it can be between 90% and 110% of the fair market rent. And so if the fair market rent for a 1-bedroom was $1,000, we could set the payment standard at $900 all the way up to $1,100. And right now we have set our payment standard at the highest we can, because it gives the most opportunity for people to find housing within the city of Ann Arbor and the rest of the county if we set it as high as we can. So what does that mean? The payment standard is the maximum amount of rent subsidy that we'll pay for that apartment. But we also have to do what's called a rent reasonable analysis. So if you're renting an apartment on Main Street in Ann Arbor, and your landlord says this apartment is whatever, $1,500, we compare it to the rest of comparable units in that area to make sure that we're not getting overcharged just because somebody has a voucher. And so if you're out on Washtenaw in Ypsi, we would do a comp for somebody in that neighborhood. So it's based on the neighborhood that the apartment is located. And so if you have income versus the more income you have, the higher your voucher rental value is, because you're adding what 30% of your income is to the voucher amount, the payment standard, and that gets you your total voucher amount to go towards rent and utilities. So you and your neighbor, if you have different incomes and you both have a 2-person household, you may have completely different amounts on your voucher, because the more income you have, the more purchasing power you have, because it's your portion of the rent plus the rent subsidy. All right, that was really complicated. I will see if there's any questions about that. It says there are other factors that play a part. Yes, hopefully I just answered that. There's further questions about how the voucher works. I'll just hold on for just a second, because it is very complicated. Yes, partially, thank you. Okay, you're welcome to ask more about that. Okay. Let me close out of this. So what does Ann Arbor look like compared to the United States? I'll just quickly go through this. Red is Ann Arbor's rents, or sorry, incomes, household incomes, and gray is the United States in comparison. So it's really high down here, and it's really high over here, and pretty much kind of similar up and down throughout the rest of it. What does that mean exactly? If you look at, so you might think, well, we have a lot of low income people and we have a lot of high income people. But if you look at who are the people who are low income, you'll see that the vast majority are ages 18 to 24. So what does that tell you? Hopefully you're thinking it's because we have a lot of students in the city of Ann Arbor. So when we look at where are low income people living in the county or in the community, we don't tend to use poverty as our indicator, because students appear to be poor because when they fill out a census form, it doesn't matter if their family's helping to pay for their housing, or if they come from a wealthy household or a low income household. If you answer on the census form, literally, how much money do you make a year? And you're like, oh, I make, $3,000 a year in a summer job. Then you are considered in the poverty category. And so it kind of skews data when you look at it that way. So if you look at poverty by census tract, the ones in purple, you can see that this very much tracks with where students live in Ann Arbor. It also tracks with, Washtenaw Community College and EMU, but other tracks where the true poverty is in the county that are not in areas where there's a lot of students are exclusively for Washtenaw County on the eastern side of the county in Ypsi City and Ypsi Township. This is one that's showing the property values. Now, this is much more stark, where you can see the values of properties of Ann Arbor in red, and then the United States in gray. And clearly our housing is way more expensive. You knew that. This is just showing you a chart. And this is Ann Arbor, not Washington County. So what is the impact on our community by having this kind of housing market? When people look at who commutes and where they live, remember I was talking about housing plus transportation costs, over 83,000 people, this is pre-COVID numbers, so it's probably a little different now, but before COVID, over 83,000 people worked in Ann Arbor, but lived outside of Ann Arbor. So they commuted into the city for their job. 24,000 people lived in Ann Arbor and worked in Ann Arbor, and about 20,000 people lived in Ann Arbor and commuted outside of Ann Arbor for their job. So when people complain about traffic and parking, the vast majority of that is being impacted by people who, by choice or because they can't afford it, don't live in Ann Arbor, but actually commute into Ann Arbor for their job every day. What is the big attraction for jobs in the city? By far, hands down, the single biggest employer, hold on one second. Sorry, my heater on. The single biggest employer is the University of Michigan, both as in the campus as well as the health system. You can see just by this chart that they are so big that they are bigger than the next, I don't know how many there are in here, 15-ish other employers combined. It's followed by St. Joe, and then General Motors Proving Ground. So what happens at the university has a huge impact on what happens in our marketplace, in our housing marketplace as well. The University of Michigan continues to add enrollment in their students, which puts housing pressures around campus. But as student enrollment increases, it also impacts employment, because it's not just students, but it's all the folks that support students, whether it's professors, whether it's people in administration, whether it's janitorial staff, security guards, all the different positions at the university that are working there in support of students, as well as the expansion of the medical center has a big impact as well. Now, the university has historically had some housing on campus, primarily for freshmen, but also they've had married student housing and some grad housing. And on the one hand, the good thing is they have allowed the private marketplace to provide that kind of housing to support students historically, which actually adds taxes to the tax base of the city, because none of the buildings that the university owns are taxable. So any campus building, including any housing on campus, it's not a taxable property, whereas students that are living off campus, those are all taxable properties. And so it does contribute to the local tax base. So that worked for quite a while, until it just was not enough, even in the private market, to provide enough housing for students and others who are want to live in or are working in the city of Ann Arbor. And that's what's causing the really high pressure on the marketplace for the housing market. It's a very simple supply and demand analysis that you can do on the city of Ann Arbor. We had a housing needs assessment that was commissioned back in 2020. We had them specifically look at what the housing demand and supply was in the downtown and near downtown, but we tried to stay away from anything that was east of, trying to get my directions right, east of State Street. So trying to stay away from the more campus centric areas. And so what they said was that we still have a demand for over 1,300 apartments or housing. It doesn't have to be apartments, for households under 30% AMI, 782 to 856 for people 31 to 60% AMI, and about 400 for almost 500 for people at the 61 to 100% of area median income. And that's just in our, downtown and near downtown area. We didn't actually go beyond that because that's one of the primary markets that we're looking at right now. So if there's such a huge demand for affordable housing, why isn't it being provided for by the private sector? I also hear all the time complaints about the luxury student housing. So going back to that market analysis and that supply and demand, there is whenever we've looked at any site and run different analysis of how do we make this a financially feasible project, and let's say there was no subsidy involved, it was just a market rate project, hands down, student housing is the most financially feasible type of housing, given the cost of land, given the cost of materials and labor. When you add that all together and you compare it to the rents that you can charge, and I'm going to show you some more detail on that in a second, that is why so much student housing is built. And then the second most feasible tends to be high-end condos, because a developer is not going to build something that they are going to lose money on. They're only going to build something that they can make money on. So it's also a very high risk. It's very high risk to do development. There's so many things that can go wrong. So I'm going to go dive a little deeper into this one. Hold on, I think it looks like I might have a question. 1 second. Nope. Oh, this is kind of in a weird order, but let me try to remember why I have this here. So when you think about affordable housing, we talked about public housing back in the 60s and 70s. We talked about co-ops, money that was available. If you look at what funding is out there in the United States, whether it's federal, state, local, for housing programs, the single biggest subsidized housing program is not HUD. HUD, I got to update my chart. Back in 2018, HUD's budget was about 42.7 million. This last year, it was more like 55, 56 million. The last 3-4 years, we've gotten significant increases in the HUD budget. A lot of it due to COVID, CARES Act, things like that, emergency housing vouchers. But HUD's budget is still only in the mid 50s of billions of dollars. In comparison, the biggest program historically for housing subsidy is the mortgage interest and tax deduction you get on your IRS personal taxes that we all pay who have income, myself included. I own my own home. Up until the tax code was changed recently to increase the standard deduction, so that many of us who may have itemized in the past are now doing a standard deduction. When people were itemizing their deductions, the mortgage interest deductions IRS subsidy was over 146 billion in 2017 compared to 42 billion for HUD. So there's not a lot of money out there to add new affordable housing units into the marketplace. In fact, HUD really doesn't have money for new housing initiatives. It's a very tiny part of their budget. The vast majority of HUD's budget now is for rental subsidies through vouchers, which is relying on the private sector to build the housing. Private sector can be both for-profit and nonprofit owners. So like we're a nonprofit, we can own housing. Other nonprofits can do it, but a lot of for-profit developers actually have part of their portfolio is housing that's affordable, whether naturally occurring or through some kind of HUD subsidized program. Okay, now I'm going to go really deep into the details. So if you think about just developing a new project, not acquiring something that's there, just like a new project, and you think about, well, why does it cost so much? Why don't we have more affordable housing? There's no difference if you think about land costs. Land costs are land costs. If I want to buy land, I have to compete with whoever else wants to buy land. So more likely than not, it's a for-profit developer. And so our land costs are the same if I can secure the funds to actually compete in Ann Arbor. It's easier in other communities. If you look at construction costs, a hammer is a hammer, a nail is a nail, a 2x4 is a 2x4. I don't get any discounts because I'm an affordable housing developer. There's a little bit of difference when you're comparing affordable housing with market rate or more luxury marketed type housing in the finishes. You know, we don't do granite countertops and things like that, but that's a very small marginal difference in the total cost of development, because the framing of the building, you know, the structural components, the HVAC, the land costs are actually a much higher proportion of your cost than the finishes that you use. The difference between affordable and market rate that are make it more expensive if you're an affordable housing developer is you can see this slim little piece in green. It's a little bit fatter over here on the affordable side. We actually, when we do affordable housing development, we get or pay or both a developer fee up front, like you'd pay an architect. Whereas if you're a private developer, you get investors to help put money in as a investment where they expect a return on their investment over time. And so they don't get a large developer fee up front like we do in the affordable housing world. It's like spread out over time, which I'll show you how that works. You know, our fees that we pay to the city are no different. I don't get any breaks from my coworkers at the city in the building department or the water or sewer or anywhere else. We have to pay all kinds of fees as well. So you can see it's pretty much the same. The costs are the same, no matter what kind of housing you're doing. Hold on, I see a question. How does a person from the private sector get involved with helping the housing crisis as a for-profit business, especially since there are factors that hinder new small business? Not sure to pronounce your name. Is it Kamika? I'm gonna hold that thought and I'm gonna come back to that. I'm just gonna set this over here so I don't forget. I don't know if this is in your guys' way or not. I'll just close that and I'll come back to that. So what the biggest difference is between housing development for a market rate versus a affordable is how it's financed. And not what it costs to build, but how do you finance what you're building? So on the market rate side, oops, I'm sorry. On the market rate side, you can see in orange, the majority of the money, typically, this is just a typical project, everything's different. The majority of the projects, about 80 to 90% is a loan. So like if you buy a house, you put 20% down and you take 80% of that as a mortgage from a lender. That's similar to what happens with private developers of like a multifamily housing, for example. So that loan is most of the funding and it has to be paid back just like anyone with a mortgage does. And then the rest in blue is equity. So that's your, you know, the investors that are going to get a return on that investment later. The single new biggest source of financing for affordable housing, and this might partially answer Kamika's question, is called low-income housing tax credits. That is the single biggest source of funding now for anyone doing any kind of new affordable housing development. And the way that it works is Congress adopts a budget. They adopt a tax credit budget, a low-income housing tax credit budget, and they distribute that to each state. And then each state administers that those tax credits. And literally, it's not cash, it's tax credits. So when a corporation is filing a tax return and they owe a lot of taxes, if they invest in this low-income housing tax credit program, then they can take that investment and write it off on their taxes. So that's a way to reduce the taxes that they pay the government. And so that's how the program works. So the state of Michigan, Michigan State Housing Development Authority, they issue every year what's called a qualified allocation plan, which is basically like an RFP. And they say, okay, here's how much money we have in tax credits. Here's how we're going to score you. Here's our categories. And then we, like other affordable housing developers, have to compete for those funds if that's what we want to do. And most of the developers are for-profit developers, not nonprofit developers. And so we compete, and we did that for most of our properties that used to be public housing, to pay for those capital improvements. We applied for these tax credits. We won them. We don't pay any taxes as the Housing Commission. We're tax-free. And so we have to sell them to somebody who actually does pay taxes. And so there's a whole world out there of what's called syndicators that help you find investors that want to pay you cash. So they pay cash for our tax credits, and then they write off that on their tax returns over a 10-year period. And they can only write those taxes off if we, as the owner and the developer and the manager of that housing, stays in compliance with the regulatory requirements of the program to serve whatever our commitment was on the income target, the rents, and we maintain our buildings. And so we have, instead of having all these HUD regulations, we now have all these tax credit regulations that are very similar but different. And when we layer tax credits on with vouchers, then we have two different regulatory environments, and we have to comply with both of them. So when you're doing affordable housing now, in comparison to market rate, you can see the blue is kind of flipped. So 60 to 70% of our projects have been paid with cash from people who bought our tax credits, and that becomes our equity. We don't have to pay it back to them. It's kind of like a grant. We just have to make sure we comply with our program requirements. And then if we can, we take the rest out as a loan. So a small portion of our properties have loans, but we can only take out loans if we're able to pay them back through our rents. So if we are targeting lower incomes, if we're trying to do housing for people at 30% of AMI instead of 50 or 60% of AMI, then we can't really take out very much of a loan. We have to actually add to it grant money. And so this is the biggest difference in what it looks like on how you pay for development. And then this is what it looks like on the operating side. So the market rate developers, what it costs to own and manage, pay for maintenance, pay for your staff, pay for your property managers. It's not exactly the same, but it's roughly the same. It's actually more expensive when you are providing housing for like homeless households or special needs households or lower income households. And when you have all these regulatory environments that we have to comply with, we end up having more staff. We end up having, more damages to units, things like that. So our operating costs are a little bit higher. In orange, remember I said that market rate housing is paid for mostly with debt. The rent has to be high enough to pay this debt. In that middle one, where we're, serving, lower income households, we only have to have enough rent to pay this much debt. And if the lower the income the household is, the less rent we get. So we have less debt we can take on. Gray is in capital reserves, is about the same. Yellow is taxes. So in addition, market rate owners have to pay taxes, property taxes. The city of Ann Arbor actually has a payment in lieu of taxes for qualified affordable housing projects, which ours do qualify. And so we actually only pay $1 per unit per year in taxes. That enables us to have much lower rents, much lower rents than what a for-profit developer needs to just break even. And then the blue is their return on their investment, their cash flow that they pay back to their investors. There's a little bit of blue in these two scenarios because anytime you take on debt, just like if you have a mortgage, your lender wants to make sure that you have enough cash flow that you're going to be able to pay off their debt. So they make you have a certain coverage, a debt service coverage ratio. Usually it's like 1.15 or 1.2, so that you have enough cash if things go awry during the year, you can still pay your debt. All right, I'm going to look at questions real quick. Okay, Kamika asked, what do you say the city of Ann Arbor incentive is that they give you? It's called a payment in lieu of taxes. So under the low-income housing tax credit program that's administered by the state of Michigan, and I'm going to tie back in cooperatives, the state of Michigan has a legislation that defines what a pilot eligible property is, and municipalities like Ann Arbor can adopt a local pilot ordinance that has to also comply with the state. So a tax credit funded affordable housing project is eligible for this pilot. A affordable housing property that is funded with federal funds is also eligible. There's certain kinds of funding that enables you to get a pilot. In addition, the state allows co-ops, that's a eligible type of housing that can be eligible for pilots. And so in order to get that, I've never done it. I don't know how you do it. I'm not an expert on co-ops. I just have seen that as one of the eligible types of programs, but it's not just that you're a co-op. There's other hoops you also have to jump through. So whenever I talk to people about co-ops and they want to have, why don't we have more co-ops? I'm like, well, you need to find a developer who knows how to do development from a cooperative model. And they can actually apply for tax credits just like we do, and use that as a funding source, because that's the biggest source of funding out there. But it does change the model of how you run the co-op, because in the co-op model, depending on what source of funding and what type of HUD program was used, you have a income that you have to meet when you move in. It's higher than our income. I've seen it at 80% AMI. I've seen it at 95%. But once you move in, unlike us, you don't have to keep getting income qualified every year. You don't get kicked out, if your income goes up. So like our co-ops are very successful in Ann Arbor because housing prices are so high everywhere else. People tend to stay longer in the co-ops and don't move on. So you have a real nice mixture of incomes. And you also aren't required to move out of an apartment because your family size increases or decreases, which is what we have to do in our housing. So as you add people to your family, we have to find you a larger apartment to accommodate your family size. And then if people move out, your kids, move out of your household, then, and your family size gets smaller, we have to move you to a smaller size unit. And that's not a requirement in the co-ops. I don't know if it's different if you take advantage of the tax credit pilot type model, but that's what I tell folks is you need to find a developer who can do that kind of development, and they need to be like any other developer that we work with. They need to figure out what is a financially feasible project and go from there. It's like, it's no different than what we do. Let me see if did I answer your questions, Kamika? And I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Yes and yes. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. Can't remember what my next slide is. Okay. So this is just a summary of all the funding I had to raise in the last, 8-10 years, and where it came from to do this development capital investment that HUD required me to invest in our own properties. It wasn't money from HUD. You can see there's a little bit of HUD money, 1.9 million. But of the 73 million, a very tiny fraction came from HUD. The rest I had to go apply for funds from other sources. Some of these sources are, here's the money, you're doing great things. And, we don't have long-term reporting requirements like the Downtown Development Authority or city funds, because they know that we have a deed restriction. They know that we have HUD vouchers and we have to follow HUD program regulations, and they know we have tax credit regulations as well. And so they don't add additional layers of regulatory requirements, but other ones do. Community Development Block Grant has its own regulations. Home Funds, which is a federal program, Federal Home Loan Bank. So we braid together lots of different funding sources to make our project financially feasible. The more grant-like money that we're able to put into the project, the lower the rents are that we can charge because it's subsidized. And that is not what happens in the market rate side. Okay, we're going to switch a little bit here. So the city of Ann Arbor adopts performance objectives, and I think this was in 2021, where they wanted to add about 1,000 units of new affordable housing targeted to 60% of median income or less by 2025. And they also want to ensure that there's a long-term funding source for those tenant services that I talked about previously, that really the primary objectives are stabilize housing, reduce evictions, build community, make sure people have a safety net, and then try to build stability in people's finances. Very lofty goals. So when we talked about land costs, when you look at all that money I told you I have to braid together to make a project happen, that takes a long time. Like that can take years. So if Joe has his property for sale out on the marketplace, listed by a realtor, it's very hard to find a seller who's willing to wait 2 years for me, just because I say so and I promise I'll come up with the money, but it's going to take me 2 years. Will you please sell me your property? But I can't give you the money for 2 years because I don't have $5 million in my bank account. And so I cannot compete with the private sector in a hot market like Ann Arbor. So over the years, I had conversations with city administrators, city council about the one way to ensure that we can actually add new housing into the marketplace that's affordable is if we look at publicly owned lands that are underutilized because they're owned outright, there's no taxes being paid. We can take as many years as we want to do community engagement, to design what makes sense for that site, and then go out and find the funding for it. And so City Council directed me to do an analysis of city-owned sites. Most of them were downtown, most of them were parking lots, surface parking lots, and then there are a few that were outside the downtown. And I'm going to go through, what that analysis was and where that's led us to right now. And it looks like we have a question. What can be done to support more mid-income home ownership in Ann Arbor? Seems like ownership will continue to be only for the affluent. Yes. If people are willing to be part of an ownership model that's condos and not single family homes, or many people think of co-ops actually as being a form of home ownership, then I think you're more likely to be successful. But again, the cost of construction, the cost of land is what's driving prices on new projects that are available, whether it's single family or condos. And so you have to have, just like on the rental side, you have to have deep subsidies to make that happen. And so there's not a similar program like a low-income housing tax credit program for ownership. There's nothing like that. There's, down payment assistance programs. There's low interest loan products, things like that. If you meet certain criteria, but right now it's primarily driven by the cost of construction, as well as for existing housing, what is the competition in the marketplace. So it is actually much more harder to do that, which is why you see lots of new subdivisions and being built, outside of Ann Arbor and surrounding townships. And if you lived in this area for a long time, like I have, the first time I saw a subdivision go up between Ann Arbor and Brighton, like 30 years ago, I was like shocked. Who would want to live way out here? And now it's like solid subdivision all the way here to Brighton in every other direction. And that's part of that exodus out of the city of Ann Arbor. It tends to be not in our city, it tends to be in and around the city. So the first thing that we look at is what are the land use restrictions, if any? How is it zoned? Are there any grants or deeds that are going to restrict what you can build there? Some legal issues. We also look at environmental conditions. Environmental conditions is not just, is there contamination? Under the types of programs that we use, you have to look at a wide variety of quote environmental conditions, including, is it in the floodway, floodplain? What's the noise in the neighborhood? In addition to any kind of contamination. The good thing about contamination, weirdly, is that that is not a barrier, because there's a lot of programs out there that provide funding for brownfield remediation that it helps to subsidize that cost and remove that as a barrier and remove that as a contaminant for the project. The thing that we do get concerned about is, I also get asked, well, why don't you acquire buildings? Isn't that cheaper than building something new? Yes and no, maybe. Depending on when the building was built, it could have lead-based paint. We have to remove all lead-based paint, where a private sector person acquiring a property does not. They just have to disclose that there's lead-based paint. If something has asbestos containing materials, that's something we have to be remediating or making sure that we are not disturbing it so it doesn't cause a problem for the household. If it wasn't built up to today's code for accessibility, we have to make accessible units. If it does not have an elevator, there's all kinds of things that we have to retrofit to make an existing property meet the standards that we're required to meet, that the private market sector does not have to meet because of the type of funding we have. And so sometimes it can end up being more expensive than just building it new. Not always. I mean, it's really dependent on what the property is and how big it is and that kind of thing. Hold on, I'm gonna see if I think I just got another question. Why is it difficult to build affordable housing within 300 feet of railroads? So the environmental, you have to do an environmental assessment whenever you use federal funds. So even highways, they have to do an environmental assessment. You hear about like the oil pipeline that people are, whose lands are going through, like Native American lands where this oil pipeline's going through their lands. They are using the environmental assessment tool, which requires any federally funded project to do this wide-ranging assessment of the impact on the community. And so that can range from the things I already mentioned to are you impacting a natural river? Are you impacting a protected species? Things like that. But one of the things is noise. So how much noise is near that site? So railroads make a lot of noise. And so whenever we do a project, we have to do a noise assessment. We have to add up the noise from the railroad, any highway, or I'm sorry, any airports that are nearby, as well as actual road noise. Now, these were all adopted in primarily like in the 1970s. Things change a little bit, but there's more and more noise. Like it's harder and harder to not have a noise impact when you're in an urban environment. And so then you have to do mitigation. So if the noise level is above a certain amount, you can do mitigation like heavy insulation, triple pane windows, things like that. But once it gets to a really high threshold, you cannot build there using any of these sort of federally subsidized funds. And that's why we have to see if we're within 300 feet of a railroad. For some reason, that was the number that someone somewhere picked as the trigger for determining, what the railroad noise is. We have to check all railroad, but that seems to be, if it's within 300 feet or less, it almost always prevents you from building right next to it with those funds. Hope I answered that question. All right, thank you. Okay, and then finances, I went into that a lot, but depending on who your income target is, are you doing a mixture of incomes? All your different operating, are your families, are you single people? Like you got to figure out where's the money going to come from. And then you also have to think about what the ownership structure is, what the market demand is, et cetera. And then we take all that analysis and we're like, okay, what are the best properties to develop within those properties that I mentioned? And I'm going to go through each one of those. But the one thing that happened, which had a huge impact on the city's ability to actually build some of this affordable housing and really make a big impact, is the affordable housing millage that passed back in November. So thank you everybody who voted for that. Every single ward in the entire city voted in favor of it. Over half the people voted in favor of it, which is amazing. What is the millage? The millage is actually able to provide, remember I talked about all the different funding sources that I'm pulling together. If you're serving a lower income target, you got to have grant money. So this is grant money that can leverage other funding sources. So I would think it would be a poor use of this millage if it paid for 100% of the entire project that we're developing, when there's other sources out there that we can leverage and spread that money farther and do more projects. So that's my goal. It's a 1 mil targeting up to 60% AMI, and it generates about $6.5 million a year, at least in the first year. And up to 20% of the millage can be used for those social services that I talked about, for those projects that the millage is used for the capital piece of it. And in addition, it's not required by law, but the city decided that no millage funds in the charter language can be used on projects that are in the floodway or the floodplain, similar to those environmental project reviews done with federal funds. Before the millage was adopted, City Council had some guidelines that they wanted to make sure were followed with those funds, and they wanted to let the public know that this was their goal. So socioeconomic diversity, not having concentration of all the low-income housing in one neighborhood. They wanted to make sure it was inclusive and equitable, serving different populations, special needs populations, seniors, et cetera. They wanted to make sure there were a variety of services available. It can be different aspects of development. It could be new construction, acquisition, demolition, any of that. They wanted to make sure it was going to be in line with our A230 sustainability goals, leveraging other funds, like I mentioned, and that whatever is done, that it is not a 10-year affordability period. It is a permanent, long-term affordability period, which in the city of Ann Arbor is achieved by having deed restrictions literally on the properties that say forever and ever and ever, these are the income restrictions on this property, no matter who the owner is. I think there might be a question. Nope, no question. Whoops, sorry. So what are we doing with those millage funds? The first thing is trying to develop those properties that the city owns that I'm going to go through, but also to build in flexibility in case there is something that comes on the marketplace, whether it's vacant land or whether it's an existing building that's like, wow, this would be perfect for affordable housing. We need some cash so we can compete with the private sector. But even when we have cash, there's many, many hoops to jump through that make it more challenging to compete, because I have to get approval from, I have to go to city council to get approval to do acquisition of property. And so it just adds extra time and layers to the process, which is not bad. It's public funds. It just takes time. And we're also doing a education series with the Housing and Human Service Advisory Board, which is a citizen advisory board for the city of Ann Arbor related to housing and services, in order for us to develop a competitive process for not just the Housing Commission to utilize these funds, but other developers. But we want to make sure that we have a way to ensure that it's qualified developers and that it's feasible projects. And so previously the question was, how does a market rate developer, one way they could get involved. One way they could do that is by applying for millage funds, but they cannot do it yet because we are not ready at this point. And they also can include affordable housing in anything that they build that they're planning on doing is market rate too. Okay. This is a project that wasn't built by the Housing Commission. It was one of the first projects that we did use millage funds on. It was actually developed by Avalon Housing. It's a 3-stage project, and they were, when they applied, they had secured all kinds of different funding sources, total of $26.5 million. And they requested to fill that final gap that they needed of $550,000 for capital expenditures. So that's a really good example of leveraging the millage with other funds so we can do more housing. So for a tiny fraction, $550,000, we're going to get 80, forget how many units, 30, 60, 70, 84 units. So that is a lot. And because the millage up to 20% can be used for services, they asked for the first year of their services were about $182,000, but that can vary from year to year. That was just the first year. Okay, now I'm going to talk about those specific city-owned properties. I'm going to try to go through these as quickly as I can. So we had a 1.5, 2-year community public engagement process. It started right before COVID. So it went from being in person to pretty quickly being all on Zoom. But we spent a lot of time talking about all these different projects. Not every single one, but most of them, sorry, to try to get a sense of what the community wanted to see on each site. And I will say it was not universal in any place, in any location, but we did get some movement toward consensus so that we could share that information with City Council so they could feel comfortable in the type of projects that we proposed to them. The first project I'm going to talk about is 350 South 5th. If you've lived here for a long time, you may remember when the YMCA was located here. They moved to their new location in the mid-2000s, and it's been a surface parking lot ever since, and has come in and out of the city's ownership and have tried many different ways to develop the site. And we hope we have come up with a winning model to actually make this project get developed this time with affordable housing. Literally on Monday night, City Council approved what we call a planned unit development, PUD, and supplemental regs for what the sort of the box maximum of the area, height, setbacks are for what can be built on this site. Our next step is to actually issue a RFP for a co-developer because we don't have the staff expertise in-house to do this project 100% on our own. So we need a co-developer to help us make this happen. And we have it, we ran all kinds of designs. We don't know exactly what's going to be built there, but we ran all kinds of models, different designs and different financial analysis to come up with what was conservatively, seemingly reasonably likely to be able to be built. COVID has really, really impacted any kind of financial underwriting of any kind of development. It doesn't matter if it's office, housing, it really doesn't matter because of the supply chain, the lack of skilled labor, the cost of materials, everything is just crazy, crazy expensive compared to 2 years ago. The biggest issues we had to figure out on this site, you can see from the picture, it's right next to Blake Transit Center. The AAATA has for a very long time also tried to acquire and redevelop and partner to redevelop that site so they could expand their buses onto that site, expand their footprint of the downtown to better serve the community. There's the library across the street. There's a lot of foot traffic. There's the William Street bike lane, the parking deck. there's all kinds of things happening on the first floor that it took us a really long time to figure out how we were going to make this work. So the first floor is always the most challenging. And so the design we came up with was the AAATA needed a actually dedicated lane, not one that was shared with the building's service lane. You know, people, every building, you're not just building the building, you're building a building that maintenance needs to get to. Now you have deliveries that come, ambulances, garbage trucks. So they needed their own dedicated lane for safety reason for passengers. So we designed it for a 30-foot bus lane. You can see these sawtooth little cutouts. That's where buses would park and then pull out. So you're adding that capacity. We have our own service lane for the building, and we have two different towers, a smaller tower and a larger tower. Because of the financing that I talked about earlier for affordable housing projects, the thing I didn't remember to say was tax credit funding is capped. So there's a capped amount on a per project basis. And when you are competing for the funds, your total development costs and your per unit costs are part of the competition. And so at some point, a moderate sized project, up to 60, 80, maybe 90 units, is really maxing out what you can do with the tax credit financing. And so it didn't make any sense to do the smaller tower any bigger than that. We're looking at as a 100% affordable with tax credit financing. And then we looked at this as a potentially a mixed income with a portion of it being affordable. We actually will not know exactly what's going to be built until we issue our request for proposal. But you can see that we have, you know, the two towers, and this is the complicated first floor. If you like biking, we had like 130 some bicycle spaces. Okay, I want to see if there's any questions. I don't think there's any questions about that site. Nope, no questions. I'm going to move on to the next site. Catherine and Fourth. So here's some of the factors I said when I did that analysis that we looked into, what kind of funding. Green star is good, blue is we better look into it. So Catherine and Fourth, actually I should say this. This site, the 350 South Fifth, the former Y site, the consensus we did hear from the community was that this really was the strongest support out of any of those sites for affordable housing. A lot of it has to do with the history of the site, where it used to have 100 single room occupancy hotel rooms when it was a YMCA, that over time became really a place where very low income households lived. It wasn't exclusively low income, but very, very many. And so when the building was condemned, all those tenants were, or those hotel units were, people were displaced. I actually worked in community development when that happened and had to be part of the staff. They had to relocate the people living in the building. Like we had 24 or 48 hours to do it. So I've been involved in this project for almost 20 years in varying capacities. And so one of the things we committed to on Monday night that City Council approved is that at a minimum, no matter what we present back with a developer, there's going to be a minimum of 100 affordable units on this site to replace what was there. My goal is to have many more than that, but we'll just have to see how the financing works. Okay. Catherine and Fourth. Surprisingly, the affordable housing wasn't the most controversial issue here. It was actually the parking. So it's currently a surface parking lot and very heavily used by people who visit this area of town, the businesses in this area of town, as well as the farmers market. So it's actually the perfect size for a standalone 100% affordable tax credit project. Like, it ticks all the boxes, very, very competitive. So really it was the parking. We had many, many discussions with the public. When we did our community engagement, we asked all kinds of questions and people rank things. And this is kind of typical of all the sites, but you can see the most popular was that people really wanted to see housing affordable at 60%. AMI was the highest. They wanted ground floor activation. pre-COVID, that tends to be retail, restaurants and different retail business, and then on and on priorities. So we issued a request for proposal, and the winning proposal, this was their rendering in their response of what they would like to see there. So it's not going to look exactly like this, but this is kind of the really where we're at on the design process. They proposed 68 apartments, 6 stories, all affordable, with supportive housing for half the units, and then people who are involved in the arts for the other half. It doesn't mean you have to make a living as an artist. And I'm not an expert on how you do this, but there's ways that comply with fair housing that enable you to reserve the units for people who are involved in the arts somehow. So our next step is to go through site plan approval and get all of our financing together so that we can have a development. So back to the parking. So what the commitment I made, because there's people who think we should not preserve any parking downtown, people should have more transportation options like walking and biking and, using transit and less cars. And then others like the merchants in that area who see this as a very important place to support their small business, not national type businesses, but small family-owned businesses, as well as supporting the farmers market. So what I've committed to is whatever we build there, we will preserve as much parking as we can, and that as much of it will be public parking and not parking exclusively private for the building. We do want to include a couple parking spaces where we'll have electric vehicles for residents to use, because they will not have dedicated parking for a private vehicle. But if they need a car, it will be a benefit of living down here that they can use a car that we would own and manage as the property owner. The proposal that we received, it was from Avalon Housing, so we're actually partnering with them, as well as Art Space on the art component. And so they proposed having some kind of cultural space, some kind of art gallery, cultural space, and some kind of small business space specifically for the Black community or BIPOC community, because this used to be the Black Business District. So the Ann Street and Catherine and 4th, this used to be the area. This used to be the area where there was a lot of industrial uses, so slaughterhouses and things like that. And so it was actually not the most desirable part of town. And so that was where people of color had to move, because there was racial discrimination in the city's housing practices. And so that grew into not just a Black community, but other immigrants that came into the community, ended up living in this area, but is now so gentrified that is no longer that cohesive community. And so we want to acknowledge that history and provide some kind of space for Black businesses to grow, and also do some kind of cultural, historical art project that also celebrates that history of yet to be determined on what that is. Okay, are there any questions about, I don't think there's any questions about this project. And this just sort of shows a floor plan of what that looks like. Okay, 415 West Washington. In my analysis, I've ranked this as a low priority because there are so many problems with this site that it is not eligible for all the typical funding sources that we would use in the other sites. But there's a lot of public support for demolishing this building. And in order to demolish this building, you have to have funding. And the easiest way to support what it would take to both demolish the building and clean up the site, because it has a significant amount of contamination, is actually to have a private developer develop the site primarily as market rate housing, to help pay for the public purposes of, I knew somebody was gonna have to ask me a question about the site, to pay for the public purposes of the demolition, the brownfield cleanup, You can see there's a chimney right here that is a habitat for a chimney swift. There's people in the community would like to see that preserved. There's people in the community who would like to see a greenway through here. So there's lots, it's also a historic district. There's lots of public needs on this site. Let me see our question. What did this used to be? This is the last use was a public works, so like a city public works. And before that, it was the county road commission. So we recently got back our studies for what kind of contamination was there. There's both some underground contamination, but contamination in the buildings. So some people wanted to see this converted into like a live workspace or a, change it into a housing as is and, adaptive reuse. But the contamination is very significant in the buildings. And it is also, because it's in a floodplain, and it's a completely asphalt parking lot, it actually is I'm not an expert in floodplains, but there's a lot of impermeable surfaces there. So whatever's built here, we would actually want to contribute to the ability for that floodway to be penetrated into the ground so that it has less impact on the neighborhood. And so this is the current iteration of what we're looking at doing. You can see we preserved the chimney over here. This bottom story is actually elevated above the ground, and it's actually parking. You can do parking in a floodplain, but you cannot build housing literally in the area that's in the floodway and a certain number of feet above the floodway. You can also see that it includes this public space, a public path going through here. And it's forget how many feet up. I think it's like 3 or 4 stories. I can't remember now. And about maybe 150-ish housing units. If the developer decides to use brownfield TIF financing, tax increment financing, which is very likely, then they will have to provide 15% of the units as affordable to households up to 60% AMI, but they cannot use the millage, HUD, or tax credit financing, but you can use other types of funds like the DDA and the brownfield funding. Oops, sorry about that. Let me take a drink. Does anybody have any questions? It's 8:02. I will definitely be done by 8:30. Okay. 353 South Main is very similar to 121 East Catherine in that it is a perfect site scoring wise, financing wise, to get enough money to do the subsidy you need for affordable housing. It's just a smaller size site. And so we went to the community and said, do you think we should do like a 6-story, which is a concrete base with a wood frame above a pedestal, or if you move to steel frame construction, you could do like a 9 or a 10-story building. And the community was roughly the, same amount of support, roughly a little bit more support for a 10-story building. And then the first floor would have some kind of active use. So it's most likely, because it's such a small footprint, to be something related to supporting the tenants that are there, but there might be an opportunity for a small first floor, like some kind of cultural or art space, something like that. The process we're at right now is we need to issue an RFP for that. 309 South Ashley, which is just 1 block over from 353 South Main, has a mixture of good and issues to look into. Nothing negative per se. It scores high for funding, but it's a really, really big site. And because I said we max out on tax credits, it's really going to have multiple buildings, or it's going to have market rate as well, most likely with market rate as well. But it is a very large surface parking lot that has a high impact on businesses in this area. And so we've recommended that before we move forward on any kind of development or planning, more planning on the site, that we really need to look at parking. So we put different kinds of options out there to the community, and people, the one that had the most support was this third one, which you can see the red is like commercial space on the first floor, the gray is parking, and then the yellow is housing. So it didn't have the maximum amount of parking that other sites did. It had a lot of housing and also some parking, and that seemed to be where most people landed. But again, it'll have a big impact on what will happen on that site for the several years that the development is underway. And so we really need to look at its parking context along with the 4th and William parking structure, and then this parking lot down here. The parking lot down here is also a place where people would like to see some kind of greenway path, but it is potentially also a place where you could do a parking deck. And you can see this little orange sliver through here is actually owned by the city. There's a vacant lot. So there, you could build a parking deck and have a pathway right up here to Ashley, so that you have easy access to a parking deck, which is much cheaper than going underground and building underground parking. So I don't know what's going to happen with this site. There's going to be a lot more future community discussions. 721 North Main, I think this is our last site. I don't know, we have one more after this in the downtown. As you're leaving downtown and you're heading toward the highway, as you get to Summit Street, there on your left is a really large, I think it's like 5, 6 or more acres of dilapidated buildings that also were a public works site that the city uses mostly for storage now. And it is 100%, I'm sorry, it is not 100%. It is everything but this little orange corner is in the floodway or the floodplain. And it also has a FEMA grant that was used to demolish a building. So you cannot build any structures in this area that's in the floodplain. You can't do it. We're proposing at 415 West Washington because of the FEMA grant. So we're proposing that the city split this little corner off that's high and dry, and we do a modest, 15, 20, 25 unit, probably family type housing in this corner right here. And the last one in the downtown is, this is Kingsley Lane. It's a condo development. 404, 406 is this gray box building right here. It currently houses the U of M Dental Clinic, rents that space from the city. And so they have a lease until the summer of 2024. So we're really not doing anything here until, we get a little closer and have more conversations with them on relocating from that site so that we can do some affordable housing here. It scores very highly and would be another perfect site for a standalone affordable housing project. I'm really thinking about it as more of a senior housing at this site, but we'll see what happens. Okay, this is just sort of to orient yourself, a map showing all 7 of those sites I just showed you. And then now we're going outside the downtown. 2000 South Industrial is where I am sitting right now because my office is in this crappy dilapidated building that you can't see that is right here. There's concertina wire going across here, and there's a big blue water tower right here. And there's a big warehouse type buildings right here. And that's where our maintenance staff, that's where their offices are. And so this is a mixed, it's got a mixed value. It's a very large site. So there's a lot of opportunities. However, it is butt up next to a railroad. So that problem with HUD and tax credit financing is there. So we're looking at trying to figure out creative ways to do housing here, and also to build a permanent place to consolidate all of the Housing Commission staff into an office building, as well as our maintenance facility. And then this is just one concept of what it might look like to do some affordable housing there. .1510 East Stadium is currently that really pretty brick fire station #2. This is right here is a gas station. And then right next to that is the Dairy Queen, sort of like to orient yourself. So this is Packard and this is Stadium. And if you drive by here, it's an old fire station. It's loaded with contamination of everything you can imagine. So we looked at doing it as adaptive reuse. We looked at it as like a 4-story, 3 or 4-story building like this. And we also looked at it as doing townhomes. So it doesn't score high due to it not being near high employment areas. Compared to a downtown, not as high a score because it's not near services as much as a downtown site, and it's small. And so we may or may not be able to use tax credit financing, and we may have to get creative with some other financing. And then my last site, this is actually owned outright by the Housing Commission, not the city. It is on Platte Road. So Platte Road runs right here between Ellsworth over here and Packard over here. And it is actually a strip of land that runs between the backyards of folks on either side of it. It goes between Platte and Springbrook. And so it is right across the street from our new property we just developed called Creekside Court. So if you look across the street from there, you'll see like a strip of land. You're like, oh, I didn't know that was there. So we're thinking about doing that potentially as somebody asked about mid-income, more moderate income homeownership. We've had conversations with Habitat. Maybe we do a partnership with them. Maybe it would be rental, maybe it'd be, entry-level home ownership. Not sure yet, but this is one of the concepts we had. It doesn't have any roads. It doesn't have lights or sidewalks or infrastructure, water or sewer. So that's a very expensive thing to add. So we'll just have to see whether we can make the finances work. Okay, I'm almost to the end. This is just sort of a summary chart of all those different sites and what the minimum or we think the high end number of affordable housing we could do if we redevelop every site. I think we could get up to 1,500-ish additional affordable housing units, whether it's rental or owner or co-op. Between all of these sites if they get redeveloped in the next 10, 12 years. I'm going to skip this because it's too bureaucratic. All right, I think this is my last slide. This is the educational series that the Housing and Human Service Advisory Board is sponsoring. That I'm working on with the Office of Community Economic Development for the county. Every second Tuesday is when they meet. And so we have a series of educational, affordable housing related educational items with a lot of guest speakers. You don't have to listen to me the whole time. And we are it's open to the public. So you can watch it live. You can ask questions. So last time we did a homeownership model, we included co-ops, land trust, and other home habitat, other home ownership models. And then the next one we're doing is going to be on sustainability, density, planning and zoning. So if that's an area of interest that you have, the meetings are 6:30 p.m. They're public. They're listed on the city's Legistar site where you can see when city council meetings are on. We're recording them, and they after the meeting's over, if you go to this site, you can you can rewatch any of the videos from any of these different educational series. So you are welcome to join or go back and look or watch future ones. And that is the end of my presentation. It is 8:13. Do we have any additional questions? You are very welcome. Could you please comment on what you think is the most important part of your job and what do you like the best about your work? Let's see, what is the most important part of my job? I think the most important part of my job, and this is conversations I actually have with other housing directors, in the state, is that acknowledging that I work for the government and it's the government's job to provide housing and services for the most marginalized people in the community who have the least access. Because you could somewhat skate through being a housing authority and own housing and be similar to the private sector and screen people out, you know, pick the best low income tenants there are and not try to house and serve people who have special needs, you know, have whatever it is, mental health, substance abuse, homelessness, whatever the issues are. And so I think the most important thing is to remember that and try to advocate for that in the community as well as politically. And what do I like the best about your work? If I could always be there when people move into our housing who get pulled off the wait list and are living in a really nice, beautiful place the first time. I keep trying to remind my staff, because I'm not the one who does the move-in. I try to remind them to like get permission to take a video that just how happy people are, just so thrilled and excited to have a place to live, to feel safe with their family. Like that's just amazing. I just love that part about it when people are happy and appreciative for what we're providing. Are we able to contact you with other questions? Yes. The best way to reach me is my email. So J Hall, Hall, J Hall at a2gov.org. So if you've never emailed anybody from the city of Ann Arbor, we are all at a2gov.org. And the 2 is a number 2. It's not TWO. So jhall at a2gov.org. And you are very welcome, the folks who we thank for the presentation. And I appreciate all of you sitting and listening to this conversation. And I wish we could meet in person because it's always fun to do this in person when we've done it in the past. Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna sit here until it looks like no one else has any more questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We really appreciate you being here with us. And that was all amazing information. So
Your head is exploding.
a little bit, but in a good way, If you do want to get into contact with Jennifer on the A2CA website that you guys should be familiar with in the resources section, her name is highlighted and it's highlighted so that way it's hyperlinked to her email. So you guys can get in contact that way, or you can let me know. But yeah, looks like everybody's just saying thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And so that will conclude that for tonight. Next week, we will be doing IT. And I think that's it. I don't think there's an in-person, but so let's everybody thanks Jennifer one more time. Thank you so much. And I will see everybody next week.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye, Jennifer.